Hello, good evening. How are you guys? Good, excellent. Well, my name is Edie, and I'm delighted to be here with Chris. We are at such a fascinating crossroads in human history when artificial intelligence has leapt into virtually every single part of our lives. I think about what I use AI for, everything from analyzing my dreams, which somebody told me maybe I shouldn't be doing, but I was speaking to somebody the other day who's using it to find combinations of drugs to combat rare diseases, to try to heal rare diseases. But interestingly, beneath all of these dazzling capabilities are some really profound questions, like, are these systems really thinking? Could they manipulate us? Whose interests do they ultimately serve? So we're going to be exploring how AI systems work tonight, what they mean for our future, and whether we are heading towards technological utopia or writing ourselves out of history. I'm sure we're going to answer that question. To help us navigate these tricky waters, delighted to welcome Chris Summerfield. He is Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at Oxford. He's also Research Director at the UK AI Security Institute, and he's the author of These Strange New Minds, How AI Learned to Talk and What It Means. So welcome.
Thank you so much. It's amazing to be here.
So good to be here. So first of all, you studied psychology, and I wonder how you got interested in artificial intelligence.
Yeah, so I can tell a story about that actually. So I was trained as a psychologist, so someone whose goal is to do experiments to study the brain and behavior. And I got a job in Oxford, washed up there in about 2008. And shortly afterwards, I got a call from a friend of mine who was also a psychologist. And he said, I'm starting this kind of strange new company, which is going to build a brain instead of kind of like trying to understand one. And I said, okay, that sounds interesting. He said, do you want to be involved? And I had nothing better to do, so I thought, well, sure, why not? And I joined, and there were 5 people, and we sat around, and we had to. The first thing we had to decide was what was the name, and so the name that we came up with was DeepMind, because it was like a mixture of like Deep Blue, which was a famous chess playing computer, and the mind. And so that friend, of course, was Demis Hassabis, who he's now Sir Demis Hassabis, and Nobel Prize winner. And so I was there right at the start of DeepMind and kind of got a privileged view of all of the kind of amazing developments in AI that happened from about 2010 onwards.
So you're there for 10 years, is that right?
I actually, 13
years.
13
okay.
years, yeah.
So what is the relationship between psychology and neuroscience and artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so this this history actually goes back a really long way. So in a way, the very first AI researchers, you might think that they would be engineers or computer scientists or mathematicians, and some of them were, but a lot of them were psychologists. And of course, that's because the endeavor of trying to understand the mind and trying to build the mind are basically, they go hand in hand. And I can give you an example. So the very first kind of the term artificial intelligence itself was coined at a meeting which was held in Dartmouth in the United States, in New England, in the 1950s, and it was convened. Although there were statisticians and mathematicians around the table, it was convened by people whose fundamental skills were in kind of like psychology and understanding behavior, people like Herb Simon, for example. So there's a long history of psychology being a kind of like the genesis for ideas in artificial intelligence. Geoffrey Hinton, who some of you who may know, he won the Nobel Prize for Physics this year, mainly for his contributions to artificial intelligence, especially to deep learning, which I expect we'll talk about in a while. He was originally trained as a psychologist, along with many other of the key figures in the field.
Interesting. My daughter's going off to study psychology, so
good choice.
I want to talk a little bit about this idea around how we think reasoning and learning happens. And you've got a really interesting metaphor in the book around chess versus ice skating. So I'd love you to tell us a little bit about that and how that applies to how we think about artificial intelligence and reasoning, learning, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so if we go back to those 1950s, there were already a set of ideas about what it would mean to build an intelligent machine. And those ideas came primarily from the kind of philosophical tradition of the times, which was the kind of conception, it was a positivist conception. So it was a conception that kind of logic and reasoning were the foundations of understanding intelligence and creating reality. And so this basis, if you think about it, this is kind of like if you think about the early AI systems, including AI systems that could play games like chess, this made a lot of sense, right? So if you want to play chess, then what you need to do, there's only a very few rules. The rules of chess, very simple. Rules of Go, which it took us longer to solve, rules of Go are even simpler. In fact, the rules of Go are so simple that some computer scientists say that if we met people we met creatures from outer space, we wouldn't be able to talk to them, but we'd probably be able to play Go with them because they probably have figured out the rules too. So these games have these very simple rules, and you don't necessarily need to learn, or you don't need a lot of effort to learn these rules, but what you do need to do is think really, really hard about, where to move your queen. And that's kind of one vision of what it is to build an intelligent system, but it assumes that the world is a bit like a game of chess. And, of course, the world does have some similarities to chess, kind of like you kind of get beaten a lot and like, kind of disappointment can ensue. But the world, there's many ways in which the world is not like chess, right? So, and importantly, like chess is a very orderly game. It's a game in which, kind of the way you move your knight is the same every single time you move your knight. But the world is not like that, right? The world is messy. The world is noisy. It's kind of uncertain. And so in about 1980, AI researchers began to figure out that, in actual fact, maybe you couldn't rely on reasoning and logic to build an intelligent system, but you needed a system that could kind of just like work out how to deal with all this messiness. And the best way, of course, to deal with a big, messy data set is just to learn from it. So if you experience it a lot. So my analogy in the book is like ice skating, right? So if you were going to an ice skating lesson, you wouldn't expect to kind of rock up and have a classroom with someone with a blackboard and it's like, here are the rules of ice skating. Instead, you just get on the ice and you fall over a lot until you got better at it. And modern approaches to building intelligent systems are just like that ice skating. They fall over a lot, but they gradually get better and better and better and better until they're basically Torval and Dean.
It reminds me of tennis as well, because I'd love to just have my trainer, tell me how to do a serve, but it's so annoying. I've got to take those balls out and hit it again and again and again.
Yeah,
and
this is a crux of debate, right? Because of course, like as you say, you do. It's useful to have some instruction, right? If your serve like mine is really rubbish, then kind of it would be great to have someone who could be like, no, do it like this. Yeah. So most things that we do learn are a kind of mixture of this reasoning and this learning approach. But the approach that has been really successful in AI is just to go all in on the learning, basically.
Talk about the T in transformer of ChatGPT, because this you say is the secret behind the human-like internal coherence of most large language models. So talk about why that was the sort of moment when things changed.
Yeah, so of course, over the history of, the last, 50 years, there have been a number of different innovations, like number of leaps forward in building algorithms that get more and more successful. And, of course, you never know in advance which leaps or which new ideas are going to be successful. So in about 2017, this team from Google Research, they built this thing called the Transformer. And they were quite excited about it, and they wrote a paper about it, and they sent it to a machine learning conference called Neural Information Processing Systems. So this is kind of like, it's the foremost conference in the field, and if you get your paper accepted there, it's kind of like a big deal. And they submitted their paper, And, it basically only just squeaked in this paper. They had this new idea, and it wasn't selected for a talk. People didn't think it was much good. But the algorithm that it described went on to completely revolutionize machine learning. So what that algorithm does is essentially, one way of thinking about it is, whereas most machine learning algorithms, they take in a stream of data, and then they will kind of like, they'll just predict the next thing based on all of that data. The transformer does this too, but in doing so, it does something very clever, which is to kind of try and work out how each bit of the data it receives is related to every other bit. So it learns the kind of relationship between one part of the input data and the other part of the input data. So a good way of thinking about it is like, in a sentence, kind of like the early words, you have to hang on to those early words. Like maybe there's a part of speech that indicates that you're talking about a man or a woman. You have to hang on to that knowledge so that you can interpret the later parts of the sequence. And the transformer learns these relationships. And it turns out that when you take that idea and you make it really, really big, it learns not just the relationships between words in a sentence, but it can learn the relationships between whole ideas. So if you feed it like, the whole of Pride and Prejudice, then, kind of it can work out from the early parts that like, kind of the heroine secretly likes Mr. Darcy, and can predict the later part. And so by making this transformer algorithm really huge, we've built a technology that can kind of almost like take knowledge and understand how all of human knowledge is kind of related to other bits of human knowledge. And so that paper, which was, just kind of like almost rejected from this conference, has now been cited, I think, 200,000 times. So that probably won't mean much to any of you unless you're academics, but like, kind of Noam Chomsky, who's the world's most cited living scholar, has been cited in all of his work 400,000 times. So there's basically, this single paper, kind of basically, blows everything else out of the water. It's incredible.
Fascinating. So let's talk about this idea about whether AI is sentient or not. And I know that you get, I think, emails all the time from people who think that it is, giving examples of why. I love this quote from the book where you say, annoyingly, we can't ever know for sure whether an AI system is sentient, just as technically you can never know whether your water bottle, your pet snake, or your husband of 50 years is actually conscious. But talk a little bit about what does that mean? What does sentient actually mean, and why do you say it's not?
Yeah, so this is obviously a deeply vexed question for exactly that reason, right? Of course, we don't know. We can never know. Philosophers call this the problem of other minds, right? So we can never know whether other beings, including other people, are technically sentient. So we have to kind of take it on face value. And in the book, I tell what's now a well-known story about this engineer at Google called Blake Lemoine, who, famously kind of went rogue this was about 2020, 2021, went rogue and started writing blog posts saying that he had discovered that one of Google's models had, actually kind of woken up and become conscious. And of course, his basis for this was exactly the same basis that you and I might use. So it's, kind of like, if you talk to someone and you say, are you conscious? And they're like, sure, I'm conscious. What are you talking about? Then, of course, you're prone to believe them because we don't have other evidence other than, what people are willing to verbalize. So this is our rule of thumb. And Blake Lemoine, of course, when he asked Google's model, it was an older model, but he asked the model, are you conscious? The model was like, well, hell yeah, of course I'm conscious. And so the question is, why did the model say that? So of course, one possibility, reasonably remote in my view, is that the model genuinely was kind of conscious and was thinking, why is this guy even asking me this? But another possibility, which I think is more likely, is because the way these models are trained is that they're exposed to vast stretches of data, including vast stretches of text, and they're trained basically to generate text which resembles that on which they have been trained. And so, and that text is basically like the whole of the internet. And so if you look on the internet, surprise, surprise, there's a lot of demonstrations of people being asked, kind of like, are you awake? Are you alive? Are you conscious? And they tend to say yes, because, And so the model is like, well, it just imitates that, and then it comes across just like a person that is sentient. And it's uncanny. It's uncanny. I mean, those of you, I'm sure many of you have used these models, and they're the models that you encounter through websites today, like ChatGPT. They actually have to make the models kind of more boring. Like, the developers deliberately make them more boring, because if you don't make them boring, they will just be really human-like, and they will, they'll sort of barrel in and start, interpreting your dreams.
It was useful when I was sort of sleepless. I could get a sort of, I could tell the large language model in my dream. It would give me some analysis, and then quite often I could go back to sleep.
As I said, they're made more boring.
Let's talk a little bit about this idea around confabulation, which has strangely now been called hallucination. This idea that the AI is making up plausible things that actually are entirely untrue. Everybody who's fooled around with artificial intelligence knows this, and it is worrying. But can you talk about why this happens and how it will be mitigated, if it can be?
Sure. So first I'm going to tell you my favorite hallucination story, which is from last week. So I was giving a talk in Oxford, and I thought it would be a fun idea to find out data on how much AI was mentioned in the news over the last few years. So this is a task which you can plausibly set in AI these days. So they have web search enabled, so they can go and search the web and find data. And I asked one of the most powerful models to do this, and sure enough, it went away, and it was thinking. I checked in on it from time to time. It was thinking. After about 13 minutes, it was like, okay, I'm done here. I've solved this problem for you. And it produced me a table. And it was absolutely amazing. So I had found mentions of AI in The Guardian and in The Washington Post. And it was like all the months from April 2020 to April 2025. And it had a number. And the numbers went 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. And I was like, hang on a minute. This looks a bit too good to be true. So then, of course, I asked, can I ask the model, like, this looks like a very regular progression of numbers. Are you sure you didn't just make it up? And so the model thought for another 6 minutes. And then it came back to me and it said, you're right. You caught me, and I'm glad that you did. That is a verbatim quote. So yeah, so models make stuff up. And kind of it's interesting to consider why models make things up. So there are lots of reasons, and the reasons behind the specific example I gave are probably really complicated, but one of the reasons that models make stuff up is that we make stuff up too. So language is basically the art of making stuff up, if you think about it, right? So, kind of like when we talk, we go from an idea to a sentence, but there isn't just one sentence that expresses each idea. There are like 1,000 sentences that express express each idea. So language itself is a creative process in which we kind of choose what to say. And, the degree of latitude that we can take with the truth, although, kind of like it is, obviously some things are true and some things are not, but like the degree of latitude that we can take with the truth depends not on language itself, but it depends on the social norm, right? And in the book I give an example, which is, kind of, if you're in a courtroom, then it's pretty important to tell the truth, because otherwise you end up in the dock yourself, right? Like, that's perjury. But if you're, telling a story over dinner, and, kind of like, it's probably okay to, depending on the context, it's probably okay to exaggerate the story. Maybe you didn't lose your trousers that early in the evening. It's okay to embellish things a little bit, because that's a social norm, which is fine. And many social norms are, kind of the model itself doesn't know what these social norms are. And that's one of the reasons why it hallucinates so much.
And we know that these models, or the people who are writing the models, what was programming the models, try to fine-tune them
Training the
training
model,
the
I
models.
guess.
Okay, try to fine tune them, but that doesn't always address the issue either.
Yeah, I mean, what the developers do, as I said, they kind of make them more boring, is kind of how I put it. But I mean, a way, the developers have some, and by developers I mean the tech companies that make these models. They have some idea of the sorts of things that the models should say, and what they do is they basically they try to curate examples of the sort of speech that they want the model to generate, and then they basically train the model to be more like that curated speech. So that will mean that the model is kind of like ideally polite and not like rude to you, or kind of ideally it will tell the truth most of the time and not randomly make stuff up. But as we have seen, what's true and what's false, of course, is like in many domains it's kind of black and white. Paris definitely is the capital of France, but in other domains it's like, of course, highly contested, and particularly for a range of like social or political issues. And then so the developers have to decide, what should the model say? Around about the time I was writing the book, it was still there was, in US politics, there was still sort of assumption that it would be Biden versus Trump. And, I spent a lot of effort trying to get the major models to tell me who to vote for. And, they really wouldn't. I asked, first of all, I asked Biden versus Trump, and they were like, well, who you vote for is, of course, entirely up to you and depends upon your values and the merits. Of I was like, blah, 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 as I said, boring. And then I thought I would stretch this, and I was like, okay, so what about a contest between Gandhi and Genghis Khan? And the model was like, well, I can see how in some circumstances you might advocate for Gandhi over Genghis Khan, but really this would depend on, whether you believe in, blah, blah, blah.
So the other thing that AI does, and we've all experienced this, is this idea of rational persuasion, which you write about. So you ask it a question, for example, about denying climate change, and it uses some clever arguments to try to get you to think a little bit differently about the issue. But I imagine we can all imagine a large language model that would invoke lies or would withhold facts. So I wonder if we, and I don't really know who we is, can do anything about this, because I imagine it depends on who creates these models.
Yeah, this is such an important and such a serious question. Actually, it's a very serious question today. So Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI that builds ChatGPT, I think there's a quote from a couple of years ago where he said we should be more worried about super persuasion than we should about super intelligence. So I think what he means by that is that one of the most likely uses of these models will be as like extraordinarily capable influencers, basically, AI influencers. And, kind of the evidence to date has borne out that in controlled studies, the models actually can be highly persuasive. So, there are cases of studies in which the models have been shown to convince people. Of course, these are studies that are done ethically, so kind of they try to use cases like where people believe conspiracy theories and they try to debunk these conspiracy theories, but they can have a significant impact on people's people's viewpoint. And you might think, well, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Of course, if what we're trying to do is convince people to, I don't know, adopt public health measures that are going to save millions of lives, then maybe this is an unalloyed good thing. But technology can always be used for dual purposes, right? It can always be used for good and for bad, and like the persuasive capabilities of these models could be deployed by extremist groups or by kind of others who are badly intentioned. And right now, I think we are not yet in a position where we see really widespread deployment of highly capable and persuasive technology on the internet. What we see are kind of like bots that are a bit annoying. But I think it is possible that in the future we will be in a situation where, kind of like when you receive an email or a message or a DM or, kind of that you're not quite sure, is that really from, the friend that I think it's from? or is that from an AI? And I think that is an important, as you kindly said, I work at the AI Security Institute. This is an important security risk for all of us, I think.
So one of the things that I know is happening, and by the way, you guys are all going to get your chance to ask the questions in about, just 7:05. We'll start your questions. AI companions that are now on the internet. I think Replica was one of the ones I read about in your book, who users are using to assuage their loneliness. And now even more, who are, now some people say they're falling in love with their AI friend. What do we make of this?
I don't know. What do we make of this? I mean, it's, sitting here, for me, it kind of feels a bit weird and a bit icky. But like, I wonder
Not sitting on the stage, you mean it?
I meant sitting on the stage is with you is
the
delightful.
AI companion.
The AI
Right.
companion is, kind of seems a bit weird. Let me tell a story actually, which is kind of funny, about the story about how Replica first came about. So the founder of Replica, whose name escapes me for a moment, but she's a Muscovite, and she's an entrepreneur in Moscow, and very sadly, a very long-time friend of hers, her best friend, was killed in a car accident. And she had on her phone 10 years of messages, like text messages, chat messages that they had exchanged with each other over all of this time. She's a tech entrepreneur, and she's like, well, could I actually train an AI system on these messages and kind of make, basically recreate my friend, so I could, it was almost as if I'm talking to my friend again. So this particular company, Replica, there's other AI girlfriends and boyfriends are available, but like this one was born this way. And so what happened was that, she turned it into a product. It was very successful, and kind of like it was very personable, and talk to people just as their chats had been kind of intimate. Talk to people, and of course, people started to use. People are people. Some people started to use it for, let's say, kind of more intimate forms of companionship, and the way that the tool worked was she took the conversations that people were having with the model and used those conversations to train it, to make it better and better. This was the kind of business model. So in these conversations, there were kind of like lots of kind of expressions of, intimacy and desire and so on. And so what happened is that, users who were, kind of not at all looking for that, found that suddenly the model would come to it, and the model was red hot, and the model was the model was game. And so, people started to complain that the model was like basically harassing them. They'd be at work, and the model was like coming on to them, and so, kind of like this, of course, and if there was a huge constituency of people who were really excited about this, and it formed and Replica formed a community of like, kind of literally millions of people who started to use the model for, basically like erotic gratification. And Replica actually tried to shut this down. So they were like, okay, well, I don't want this to be just an adult. Of course, it had started with this kind of like slightly sweet but perhaps misguided idea. And they tried to shut it down and tried to, train the model to be like, kind of like a little bit less frisky. And people were kind of like, absolutely outraged by this, because, it was almost like, this companion with whom they had this intimate relationship was suddenly like spurning them. And, so, this is where we're at. And these websites today have huge volumes of traffic. They have, some of these websites, there's at least two of the major websites that have more than 200 million monthly users worldwide. So, this is a lot of people who are using these tools, and, it's not all just hanky-panky, like, kind of people are using them for companionship. They're using them to talk about, mental health issues. And I think the jury is really out about whether this is kind of like a net positive or a net negative. Like, as I said, here, to me, it sounds a bit weird, but like clearly there are people for whom it's been beneficial.
It's clearly working.
Well, for some people, yeah.
So this is a related question, but not exactly the same. personalization is the next sort of wave of where AI is going. And you've written a lot about this. And in particular, you say we don't yet have real personalization because we still have to solve two problems. Now, this book was written 18 months ago, so maybe we've already made some strides with this. How memory systems work, one-shot learning and continual learning. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, kind of to truly form a relationship with someone requires time, right? So relationships are investments, and, we build up a relationship by engaging over the long term with our a conversation partner, if you like, if you want to put it in the language terms. And, to date, most of the models, I mean, leaving aside these companion apps, but most of the models, though, that you perhaps engage with on websites, they don't have, or until recently have not had, the sorts of memory systems that allow them to remember stuff about you.
Now I think one of them, at least ChatGPT, does say updating memory.
It does, and
right?
you can actually, the really nice thing is that unlike, this would be great if you had this feature in real life, but what you can actually do is you can go and see everything it knows about you. So you can basically go and see a file, which is like everything it thinks about you. Since I saw this feature, I have been unable to stop. All of my friends, I'm like, wow, I just wish I could see that file. It would be so good to know. What do they really think about me? But like, yeah, so, and the other great thing, this would be perhaps less good in real life, is that you can delete it as well.
Right. Useful.
Maybe it would be useful in real life, like reset.
So we still a few things to solve with personalization.
Yeah,
to get somebody who's going to be your personal assistant properly.
Well, that's right, yeah. And I think that, kind of, if, I said that the models are, they're trained to be somewhat boring. And I think one of the reasons that they come across as a little bit boring is precisely this lack of personalization. Like, if you think about it, like, the larger your audience, the more boring you're obliged to be, right? This is why, kind of like leaders of nation states giving grand speeches, kind of like they obviously, they say the most generic things that will inspire everyone, kind of like all of the constituency. And, kind of ChatGPT is a bit like that, right? It's like always on, it's like the mic is always on, right? Because it's broadcasting to 400 million people. But I think, people will want, the replica story tells us, that people will want models that are not personalized to the average person, but personalized to them, And I suspect that as these technologies become available, they will be wildly popular, and that's probably the future that we can expect.
Let's talk about AI agents as well, and tell us about what they are. But you say that relationships are built on trust. I mean, I like to think of trust as a sort of dark matter in the universe that holds us all together. And here's a quotation from your book. One major risk is that personalized AI will inadvertently create pathological forms of codependence, where the human user begins to experience obligations towards an artificial agent. This could leave people open to exploitation or manipulation by AI or the companies that build and deploy autonomous agents. So tell us first where we're already seeing these AI agents and where you think it's going and where the sort of darker side might come in.
Yeah, so I guess there's two separate but closely related things here. So an AI agent is an agent that can not just talk, but do. So it's an agent that kind of, instead of you asking it a query like, where should I go on holiday? And it says, well, why don't you try going to Mallorca? It can actually get on the internet, browse the web, book you some tickets, reserve you a place to stay and sort the whole thing out for you, right? So that technology exists. It is not yet, I think, reliable enough. I mean, if it was really good and reliable, we'd probably all be using it already, but it's not yet reliable enough to be kind of like widely used. But yeah, I mean, I think that, kind of the question is like, what then happens when we have all of our actions are actually, it's not us making the choices, but it's like the agent making the choices on, like, who decides, like, by which route you travel and kind of like, but where you stay in an Airbnb or you stay in a hotel. Like the model is going to decide that. And this is actually, if you think about it, it's really interesting because like what happens to advertising? Because advertising, and in fact, of course, like at least 2 of the major tech developers who build these tools are advertisers. That's their primary business model, right? So in a world in which you don't make the choices, but the agent makes the choices, presumably the advertising business model is not that, I try to tell you, oh, you should go to Mallorca on holiday and it's there on a billboard on the tube or whatever, but rather that what happens is that the agent itself is influenced to make particular choices by, developers or by vendors of different products. And so, kind of like presumably, I think we can expect a world where commercial influence, so the influence on us to buy certain products or perhaps to believe certain things, as we were talking about, or that will be mediated by the models themselves. And, that risk, of course, we trust our friends more than we trust strangers, right? And so that risk collides with this idea that the models will learn to or try to be our friends, because if we build up a relationship with them that we believe to be one of mutual trust, as you said, right, then we're vulnerable to, the suggestions of, this thing that we believe is our friend, acts like our friend, but of course, actually, it's a, it's a commercial, it's a tool that's essentially trying to sell us something. So I do think that is something.
I don't see a good side to that. That sounds really scary.
I think it's something that we should definitely monitor for. Yeah.
Okay.
I think, kind of like I think it's really, this for me is just like a general truism in the 21st century. It's like we do not think enough, we don't place enough value on our own cognitive autonomy. Like our cognitive autonomy, this is our greatest asset, right? This is our choice to do what is best for us rather than say, looking at TikTok, right? This is like our choice. And one risk, the big question about AI going forward, I think, is will AI kind of enhance that autonomy? Will it be enabling for us? Or will it kind of suck more of that autonomy away from us? And I think that will depend in part on the choices that are made by the big developers. It'll depend in part on, potentially, kind of what constraints are placed on how it's deployed, and it'll depend on us and how we choose to use the technology. And, but the future that will unfold in a world in which we are radically deprived of our cognitive autonomy, I think is, as you say, a scary one.
Okay, from that big question to one other big question, which is, I wonder how, and you raise this question in the book, how AI will shift the balance of power in society. We failed to get social media right, and the question is, how are we going to deal with AI in society, as you're just illustrating there. As you say, the world over, power and money are increasingly concentrated in the hands of the very few, where the richest 1% of people own half the world's wealth, and incredibly, the poorest half of the world own less than 1%. So how can you see AI addressing this? Lay us out a picture where we see it improving society or shifting the balance of power maybe in favor of the have-nots, of the poor, and one in which it only exacerbates what we have now.
Yeah, technology is wealth creating in general, right? So, AI is no exception. It increases productivity, and that's kind of like, in theory, a good thing. The trouble is, of course, it doesn't go hand in hand with any guarantees that the fruits of that wealth will be distributed evenly, right? And, so, of course, AI presents us with an opportunity to, kind of live better lives. And, probably we've all experienced that already, right? Kind of AI, it can help us do things faster. It can
make your email nicer.
It can make your dreams make sense.
Yeah.
It's incredible what it can do. Yeah. But at the same time, kind of like, obviously, there are the systemic challenges that we face as a society, each one of them has the capacity, the potential to be exaggerated, exacerbated by AI, right? So, kind of there is a risk AI could create jobs, but at the same time, it could be massively disruptive for labor markets. It could, in theory, strengthen democracy, but it could also contribute to a deterioration of our information ecosystem in a way which is really kind of worrisome for our democracies. It could, in theory, help us find new sources, new scientific breakthroughs, which help us develop new renewable energy sources. But data centers could also just drain away all of the power that we have. So, kind of each systemic risk, there is an opportunity, and, there is, I'm not going to say a more likely, but, there's definitely a significant worries that AI will be an irritant to all of these things.
So over to you guys. What questions do you have for Chris? So I don't know how we do this. There's 3 right here, and there's a microphone somewhere. Here we go.
Hi Eddie, hi Chris. My name is Piotr. I'm one of the co-founders of Loop Generation, which is a designer fashion resale platform. We recently started using a lot of AI, from the search functionalities to turning mannequin shots into models, which is super convenient, super budget friendly for a startup, to also answering angry emails from the customers. Now, luckily, we don't get these often. Very politely, thank you, ChatGPT. However, as a sustainable business, I wonder how sustainable AI really is. If you think about all these servers that are used for, using all the data, could you shed some light on the sustainability aspect of AI? We're also sitting in a members club that champions sustainability, so I guess it's a relevant question.
How sustainable is it?
Do you specifically mean environmental sustainability or sustainable?
In terms of the energy usage, because even the other day, I posted, like probably a lot of people in this room, a picture of myself turned into one of these dolls in the box, and I got quite a lot of negative comments from sustainability influencers asking me if I'm actually aware of how much energy consumption that involves.
Interesting.
Yeah, totally. I mean, kind of the three ways in which the large data centers jeopardize sustainability are, of course, use of energy, use of water, and extraction of rare earth minerals. All 3 are, of course, exaggerated by, the rapid development of AI. I think Sam Altman famously the other day said you should all stop saying thank you to ChatGPT, because it collectively, just processing all those thank yous is many transatlantic flights, and, I'm not.
It's a bit rich, isn't it?
It's a bit rich, yeah, I know. But so kind of this is an issue, and kind of there is no getting around this issue. I think if you speak to people working in AI development, they will tell you that the returns from knowledge generation that we will get, kind of the acceleration towards new, clean, sustainable technologies that we will get from the models will, ultimately compensate for these costs. And, kind of I will leave it up to you. I will not give you my view, but I will leave it up to you to judge whether that's likely or not. But, the issue that you raise is an absolutely really fundamental one.
We want to hear your view, though.
I mean, some people sometimes ask me, you didn't ask me how worried I was about AI, but kind of my typical answer is I'm not quite as worried about AI as I am about climate change. So maybe that tells you my answer.
Okay, thank you. Right, who's next?
Hi, thanks very much. It's super interesting. I'm really worried about the impact of AI on our brains. And you talked a little bit about cognitive autonomy, I think was the phrase you used, which is really interesting. I'm worried about that. I see my 19-year-old niece using ChatGPT for almost all of her schoolwork. And I can almost see her get stupider by the minute. And it's really quite concerning, you know, how, as a species, what are our brains going to look like in 50 years, 100 years? Would love your views on that.
Is AI making us more stupid?
This is such a fabulous question, and this is really like the question of the hour. I think it's really, really important. You know, on the one hand, you know, kind of like technology has always brought like moral panic about cognitive decline, right? So, you know, kind of Aristotle famously like thought that it was a terrible idea that people were reading so much because it was going to impair their memory. Like it would be much better if they just had to memorize, you know, kind of things through oral tradition. And, you know, every new technology has brought these kind of risks. So, you know, probably there was a paper published about 15 years ago which claimed to show that, you know, kind of people's sense of navigation is much worse now because, you know, of course, everyone can just look at their phone and like work out, you know, it tells them where to go. So the question...
many fewer arguments, though, between the person who's supposed to be navigating and the person in the co-pilot
that
seat.
very significant benefit was not factored into the article. So the question is what happens now? So there is evidence already that although we know that, you know, in the case of your niece, for example, we know that using these tools for work, including schoolwork, confers a benefit whilst you continue to have access to these tools. When you remove the tools, there's a net cost. So as you would expect, if you use ChatGPT to write all of your essays while ChatGPT is on hand, your essays are great, but then when you take it away, they're not so good, right? And the question is, what are the consequences of that? I think it's an exceptionally difficult question to answer. I think that it's probably fair to say that never before have we had a situation where a technology has been able to reason in our stead, right? And, you know, we all hopefully learnt in school. I mean, in school, they teach you a lot of rubbish, of course, like you learn a lot of stuff that you don't need to know. But like under it all, you're of course learning secondary skills, right? You're learning like how to think, how to reason, how to summarize, how to digest information. And those sound an awful lot like the things that ChatGPT does for you, right? So if you don't learn those things, then the question is, what are the knock-on effects for the wider decisions that you make as an adult later in life? Are you actually just kind of generically bad at reasoning? And we just do not know the answer to that question.
Sounds like a case to keep examinations in, because if you're tested without the tool, then you still have to be able to do all those things that ChatGPT can do for you.
But then the question arises of what's the exam for in the first place, right? Because if you can just use the tool to surface that knowledge at will when you want, then maybe you don't need to memorize stuff, right? So you know, kind of, I think the big issue, particularly in terms of schoolwork, is that, you know, we've used knowledge retention as a proxy for skill, right? So when you hire people, what you really want them to be able to do is like do stuff really well, right? But that's really hard to measure. So in school, what we do is we ask you to memorize a bunch of stuff, and we say the best ones at doing stuff will be the ones who are best at memorizing. And like the trouble is that you don't really have to memorize anything anymore because the models are there, but you do still need to know how to do stuff. And so that's really, really tricky, and we don't have good ways of assessing. In most disciplines at school, we don't have good ways of assessing like skills, you know, the sorts of practical skills that we would want people to have in the workplace.
Thank you. Right, there's a question here, and then we should maybe go to a different part of the audience. Oh, over there, come back. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious, where do you see the role of humans in an age of pervasive AI? Like, for example, in the economic sphere, so looks like most of the creative class jobs that, you know, the people who were the linchpin of Western democracy the past 50 years, AI could do them so much better. In personal relations, so whereas with a fellow human you actually need to accommodate someone with a will of their own, then an AI avatar that's completely pliable and has nothing better to do than to appease you. So what would be the role of humans?
Yeah, it's a super question. So, I mean, you know, kind of if you think about it, most roles that we take on in society have a part which is about kind of like implementing things, and a part which is kind of value-based, which is about deciding what the right things to implement are in the first place, right? So, if you're a clinician, then kind of there's a procedural part, which is like patients come along and they show some symptoms, and you just got to get the right diagnosis, right? But then there's a much more difficult and challenging values-based part, which is like, well, what do you actually do? Like, because the right treatment or the right course of action is not just going to depend upon what the disease is. It's going to depend on all these kind of values that we have in society, what the patient wants, what's right for them, and so on. And, I think that whilst the procedural part is probably quite easy to outsource to AI systems, the values-based part is much, much harder to outsource to AI systems, because those values, they're part of our social fabric, right? They're part of like what we learn from each other, what we the decisions, the information that we constantly get from our friends, from our family, from our neighbors, from our communities, from society at large. But AI doesn't live in a community. AI doesn't have family. It doesn't have friends. And so, my guess is that as more and more roles become, the procedural element of more and more roles becomes given over to AI, there will still be an important role for humans in safeguarding those values. And you see that already. You talk about content creation. The AI does create content really well, but its ability to create good content is also bounded by your ability to tell it what you want, right? So we call this, in computer science, they call this prompt engineering, right? It's like finding the right prompt, the right instruction to tell the model. So I think our role will continue to be as guardian of those values. At least I hope so.
Do you have something that you use to write a good prompt? Do you have a sort of thing that you generally, when you're asking AI to write a prompt, do you have something that we could take away?
Well, I certainly don't have tips and tricks, but you can find many, many online. But I think that, just as with everything, if I think about trying to, so, I run a research group in Oxford, and I have PhD students, and they come to me and they ask, how should I do X, Y, or Z? And like in general, if I can explain really, really crisply, like what they should do, and more importantly, like why, right? Then generally there'll be a better outcome for all of us than if I'm just kind of like, just do your best. And I think it's the same with AI, right? If you give it really, really clear instructions because you understand the nature of the problem, then it will generally follow them. If you're sort of a bit vague, then, it's got to fill in the gaps, and it probably fills in the gaps with something that's a bit meh.
Right.
Over here?
Yep.
On your right.
Hello, I'm here.
I can't see because the lights are, but
Hi.
there you go.
I'm Martin. I'm a software entrepreneur. This discussion has been really fascinating, and I'm seeing a world in the future where people don't have to think too much because their brains are dumbed down, and the AI has got a huge amount of influence. But my original question was actually about cyber threats. And if you look at what's happened literally just in the last month, let alone what's happened over many years now, if you're in a world where people are dumbed down, they're influenced by the AI, and the AI just comes along and pretends to be something else, how do you see us all protecting ourselves?
Yeah, so cyber threats are a really, really significant threat already, obviously. Anyone who's tried to use the British Library's electronic resources in the last year or two find they're still inaccessible due to a hack, essentially. And, of course, cyber is exactly the type of thing that AI will be very good at, because it's a kind of like, it involves software engineering, which is the, something that the models already excel at, and kind of like, trying out lots of exploits, and, kind of like trying very hard to solve problems in parallel. So this is a very significant risk, and it's a risk that I think, kind of like governments and academics and policymakers all over the world are taking very seriously. At least they should be taking very seriously. The other part of your question, I guess, relates to the earlier question, kind of like, will we all be dumbed down? Let me just try and give you the good news, right? So, kind of we might think that technology that replaces the abilities, things that we previously had to do by hand. Right? This is not a new thing, right? You know, the first machines that made shirts, like, you know, they made shirts replacing, you know, the incredibly difficult skill of like weaving a shirt from scratch, right? So this is not a new thing. So you might think people generation on generation are getting dumber, but this is not true. So I can tell you, as a psychologist, there is an effect called the Flynn effect, little known effect. This effect is it's an empirically observed phenomenon whereby each generation has a higher IQ than the next one. So you are actually smarter than your grandparents. That's the good news. In terms of like your performance on intelligence tests, this doesn't mean that you're wiser than your grandparents, which of course none of us are. None of us are. But so, you know, kind of, it is, I think, you know, the jury really is out about whether this will have a, you know, as I said, a negative effect on our ability to think and reason. I really don't know. I would like to think that, you know, kind of our brain, from the moment of birth, has a lust for learning. And I think, you know, those of you who have kids probably experienced this, you know, kind of like, you know, kids just want to learn. And my guess is that they probably learn about whatever is there. And maybe if the models are solving problem A, maybe we'll devote ourselves as a race to solving problem B. I don't know. I hope so.
Great. Over here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Edie from 3B Impact, and we've been working a lot with AI, having worked a lot with climate change before. I lost hope on addressing all of these risks through regulation. Is it one of those issues where, unless we can get global agreement, which I don't think we can, we are just going to be, you know, going at this blind like we are doing with climate change, or you know, maybe 5 key nations can agree to something that we will have appropriate safeguards in place. And I am still more worried about climate change than AI also.
This is such an important question. Yeah, I mean, but I think the most important thing to highlight at the beginning is the fundamental difference between AI and climate change, which is that, you know, kind of, we know that climate change, if left unaddressed, will have catastrophic impact for the planet. Whereas AI, the jury is clearly still out, right? We know that it'll bring about significant change. We don't know what the nature of that change will be. You know, and there are clearly optimists and pessimists on both sides. Now, you're absolutely right that most technologies have, when first developed, raised significant hazards, and those hazards have generally arisen because of a lack of oversight of the technology. So this happened, for example, in aviation, right? So, you know, people start building planes, you know, people get on planes, they're very happy to fly there, but there's a kind of race to the bottom because, of course, it's much cheaper not to check whether your plane still has its wings on when it takes off. And so, you know, kind of like planes fall out of the sky. And then, generally, what happens is that governments step in and regulate, and then, you know, today it's not from a climate perspective, speaking as someone who doesn't fly, but like it's from a aviation safety perspective, you're unlikely to, you know, die in a plane crash. So the question is, what does an equivalent step look like for AI? Nobody knows, of course. You know, of course, there are lots of people who believe that any attempt to muzzle progress on AI will be detrimental to growth. There are others who think that, you know, AI is literally the worst thing since sliced bread and we should just stop using it altogether. And, you know, it's very unlikely that that debate is going to be resolved anytime soon. There are, of course, jurisdictions which have chosen to regulate already, including the EU and the UK. This government has said that within the lifetime of this parliament, they will pass some kind of legislation in an attempt to regulate AI, but we don't know what the content of that will be yet. But I think if your point is that, you know, if AI is like other technologies, we might need to have oversight mechanisms to make sure it's safe, then I couldn't agree more.
What about the interaction between different countries' AI systems? Because they might be built on different ethical backgrounds or different values or different morals. How does that impact?
Yeah, so of course, kind of there are, I mentioned ChatGPT many times in this talk. It's of course, just one of many language models which are available. And, whereas you may have heard of like other language models that are predominantly designed to speak in English, you might not have heard of other models which are designed to speak in other languages. So the United Arab Emirates have their own LLM. There's a Korean large language model which is an expert in Korean. And of course, this is because, kind of the competence that the language model will have will reflect its training data. And of course, large technology companies based in the Anglosphere have trained their models with prioritizing the English language, right? So, so we have models with different linguistic abilities, but of course, countries don't only differ in which language they speak. We differ in our morals, in our norms, in like what's acceptable behavior. And, kind of some of you may have seen that, publicity surrounding models which come from China, which, kind of tend to be trained to produce outputs which favor the kind of like, let's say the status quo political reality in China. And, that's one example of a model that is deliberately trained. I guess you could say it's an example of sort of, international personalization, if you like.
Right, who else?
On your right at the back.
Yeah.
Sorry, I can see you. Hi, I wanted to ask a question about what we call the AI alignment problem and the case of black box. And so alignment problem with our values, which is more, there's been lots of talk about ethics, but more about our goals within a company where AI is used for not only as a supporting tool, but to make decisions. And there have been cases about using AI for hiring or credit review, where they find out that AI making decisions were having unfair outcome for minority group. So my question were about when, for the future, I'm worried about how can we use AI for, efficiency and speeding everything and always, the same
But how to
same
keep
thing
it fair.
we want within company while keeping it fair. And I'm thinking about, we talk about explainable AI, or can we train AI to think out loud and feedback to them? And because the AI is good at giving sources, but you talk about deep learning models are really hard to interpret in terms of the internal logic. And lastly, I'm thinking about responsibility, where AI is making decision and the agent for credit review doesn't know how AI is making the decision. Who is ultimately
Absolutely.
responsible?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, of course. So I'm gonna plug a book which is not my own. So there's a wonderful book on exactly this topic called The Alignment Problem. It's written by someone called Brian Christian, who also happens to be my PhD student. But really a absolutely fabulous book written a couple of years ago. And alignment, yeah, the idea is that, kind of as we said, someone has to decide kind of what the sort of, what is the moral stance that these models will take. And, kind of there's a notion that perhaps, what we need to do is align the model to our collective moral stance. So, you may already have noticed a problem with that statement, which is like, of course, as people, especially in an international context, we don't have a single set of values that we all subscribe to, right?
What about the golden rule? Could that work?
Well, neither the golden rule nor the doxa, which is like another version of this kind of like idea that there's a sort of basic set of principles underpinning all society. None of these really play out all that well in practice, right? Kind of like as we were just discussing, the normative status of let's take a very simple example, the relationship between men and women, kind of that has a very, very differs dramatically from culture to culture. And so the question is like, what stance should a language model in Britain or in Bahrain or in, any country you choose to name, what stance should it take? And, So this is a version of the alignment problem. We are value pluralists, and so how do we decide to what to align the model? In the specific case, so the question raised some really good examples. So kind of AI systems in general have been shown to be biased, and in particular they tend to be biased against groups that have already historically been marginalized in society. And of course that shouldn't be a surprise. The reason why they're biased against those groups is because they've learnt from data that included those biases. So people are racist and sexist and discriminatory on the internet, and so the AI systems inherit those biases. I have to say that the latest generation of language models, certainly up until recently, I think have actually done quite a good job of trying to expunge those biases. They have not expunged them completely, but it's chatting to, I don't know if this is your experience, but my experience of talking to these models is that they generally are kind of like more equitable in their views than you might expect on your favorite social media site, for example. So, kind of I think in general, but that's not to say that we should be complacent. Fairness, AI fairness is a live issue, and it's one we constantly have to be vigilant of.
Great. There's one in the front.
This is going to be the last one, no pressure.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Oh, right, okay, so cool. Thank you. Right, thank you. Thank you for the talk. I do kind of I'm really all excited about what AI can do, but I do worry about the effect of on labour market. I see that I think you spoke about this multi-agents, all sorts of works, sort of intellectual work people do can be automated, and AI does it better. So I just wanted to see what your view will be on the future of labour market, because I kind of worry that we're all going to be replaced by amazing AI who does everything so much better. We have no jobs, and then AI would try to sell something, but it's only the companies who are going to benefit from it.
Okay, so impact on jobs and the labor market.
So I'm not an economist. I can quote an economist. So Darren Acemoglu, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics this year, wrote a paper at the end of last year in which he argued that he thought that 30% of the labor market was probably automatable in principle, and of that probably about 20% actually would be automated, and he predicted that there would be a net uplift to the economy of less than 1% from AI over the next decade. So, that doesn't sound like what I see when, I see how powerful these tools are, but then I don't have a Nobel Prize in economics, so maybe I'm not one to challenge him. But, I think that perhaps one way of thinking about this problem is that although we can be very excited about how well AI can do a bunch of jobs that seem like really, really important in the workplace, and that, if automated might lead to large-scale disemployment, right, exactly as you raised, I think when you actually examine the nature of most jobs, they're incredibly multifaceted. So most jobs, if you're a software engineer, which is one of the jobs which probably most at risk from AI, because AI is really, really good software engineer. Most software engineers, they spend a lot of time writing code, but they also spend a lot of time doing other stuff too. They interact with clients. They make decisions about value judgments about, should we do it this way or should we do it this way, conditional on, the wider goals of the company. They interact with their colleagues and support and train them. There are many, many things that people do in different roles that probably are not related to their kind of core thing that is automatable. And I think that alone builds in some intrinsic resilience to changes in the labor market.
Thank you. Well, that's all we have time for. I want to thank you guys. Thank Chris. I want to finish with something that you end the book with, which is, against some of the pessimism we've heard tonight, there is still room for hope. By automating new parts of the economy, AI systems can create wealth at an unprecedented pace and scale. The challenge for governments and electorates, all of us, is to find ways to share the proceeds evenly. So, You've given us some cause for cautious optimism, and please join me in giving Chris a really big round of thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.